I want to tell you the place matters. We talked about health. There's a 41-year difference in your lifespan, your expected lifespan, depending upon what neighborhood you live in the United States, 41. A more typical difference will be 20 years.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. The 2024 PovertyCure Summit, Dignity, Agency, and Charity was a virtual event put on by Acton Center for Social Flourishing. Over 2 days, participants learned from scholars and practitioners involved in the global struggle against poverty and against, quote, toxic charity, unquote, that hinders people's ability to rise. On today's episode, we bring to you a presentation from Dr. Seth Kaplan, author of the book Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time. He talks about why American society is in trouble and what we can do about it. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Thank you very much. Welcome again to the 2024 PovertyCure Summit. We're delighted to have you here. We're delighted, as I said in the morning, we started this in 2020, and it was all virtual, of course, because it was 2020. And then in 2022, we began having a hybrid event, and again, 2024. So we're delighted to welcome people here at the Acton Institute and all people who are watching online from all over the world. We're delighted that you took time to come and join us for this conference. And I'm very, very happy to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Seth Kaplan. Seth is the author of this really excellent book, Fragile Neighborhoods. It's so excellent, we have a copy for everybody who's here. You get a copy if you stay for the whole lecture. No, you can have. So Seth is a leading expert on fragile states, and he's going to talk a little bit about it. But Seth travels all over the world working on fragile states. And he'll probably tell you a little bit of this, but he came in, after a while, people said, well, is the United States fragile? And so he thought about it, and he wrote a book about it. And it's on fragile neighborhoods, that we do have some fragile neighborhoods. He is a professor, professional lecturer at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is a consultant to the World Bank, the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, OECD, lots of NGOs. He works all over the world. He lives in the Washington, D.C. area. And I just want to say before I bring him up, so I found Seth's work, kind of through some colleagues. We started reading his work. I've interviewed him before a couple times. I've interviewed him for a film we're working on. And he's just a wonderfully insightful person. And so I know some of the people here working in local Grand Rapids. I keep trying to bring Seth here to meet all the great people in Grand Rapids, because he has so much, I think, that we can learn from. So I'm very delighted to welcome Seth Kaplan, and he's going to speak about why American society is in trouble and what we can do about it. So, Dr. Seth Kaplan, thank you.
So first, thank you, everybody. Especially thank you to my hosts, Michael, Caleb, and everyone at the Social Flourishing Center. It's a great privilege, honor to be back in Grand Rapids. And let's put this down. If you travel around the United States, as I've had the chance to do a lot in the last couple of years, we know that this place is doing very well, relatively speaking, and we can just see it on the streets. And so I think people who live here are really lucky. This is a really great place to spend part of your life. So I'm to write a book, I would just say it's a very painful experience. I know some people, they can just sit down and write. For me, it's somewhat painful. So I wrote this book because I thought, at least thinking domestically about our country, that the problems with our social fabric and what I see happening was the single biggest issue And therefore, I was going to spend 5 years of my life to dive deep into this issue. So I want to say that this, I mean, you really have to be passionate about something to really write a book. Usually for me, you need an emotion, and my emotion tends to be anger. I'm really angry at how those people think about something, and therefore I'm going to tell them how to think differently. So this is whatever. So, but I also would say is there's two things that are very different about my work from most people who talk about this issue. One is, as you'll see, a lot of focus on place. Place is tremendously important. The title is Fragile Neighborhoods, because we have a lot of data, as I will talk about, that shows that literally your whole life, in terms of your trajectory, your chance for economic opportunity, your health, is very neighborhood, place specific. And second, I mean, I tend not to get paid for writing fancy academic papers. I get paid for having practical solutions to help people. So most of my work starts with an introduction to what we know in terms of data, but I try really, really hard to get practical examples of things that are working and learn from those examples, and we end up with a lot of practical takeaways. So without further introduction, let me just say a little bit about myself. Those are the countries that I've been to. I've been in about 75 countries. I have worked in some form on maybe 35 countries. I co-manage an organization that's in about a dozen countries. And this is some of my work. I wrote the first book on fragile states. That's 16 years ago. I was the middle document is the one and only United Nations World Bank joint report. These two organizations don't work together normally, but they wrote one report 6 years ago on conflict prevention, and I was the senior advisor. And this is the organization that I co-manage, based in Barcelona. And that's one of our, we do mostly shorter, demand-driven, but that was one of our longer documents we published several years ago. And so I just like to give, especially because we have a large global audience, and today, and I think for listening and watching this afterwards, I'm just going to give you a couple of slides about what is unique about fragile states and why solving many of their challenges is difficult. And this is going to lead into how I discuss the United States. So this gives you a few bullets about what we see are different in fragile states. Fragile states are about, I would say, 1/3 of the world's countries. Most people, when they say, is this country fragile or not, I mean, you can use lots of ways to, they see a country doing bad, they just call it fragile. There's a war, this country's fragile. I don't think of it that way, actually. When I wrote that book that's on this couple of slides ago, one of my case studies is Syria. I went to Syria before the war, and it was the most peaceful place in the Middle East. In fact, it was a very interesting country to visit, and felt completely safe. And nobody would think of it as a fragile state, but I'm saying this is a fragile state because if you're looking at the political, social, cultural dynamics and some of the factors within the country, that is what makes a place fragile. I would say a fragile state is highly conflict prone, very hard to have a stable political order, and that's because populations are very divided, very weak social cohesion. And there's no institutions that can manage differences between groups. Just imagine that combination. If you have strong institutions that can manage differences, you can solve problems. If you have social cohesion, you can manage differences. If you have neither, and those two feed on themselves in a very negative dynamic, so that is the two things I always start looking for in fragile states. There's other things I look for. How are elites connected to society? How effective are governments outside of capitals? One of the interesting things, if you travel around a lot of the world, is governments can control capitals and can do not a great, but they can do something in capitals. But the farther away you go, you get to see this very little projection of authority or capacity across distance. I mean, you might have seen that in Afghanistan, but that would be true in most of Africa That will be true in significant parts of the Middle East, even parts of Latin America. We're just talking before about how great the coffee is in Colombia. Travel around Colombia, see the geography, and understand why this country has very rarely had peace in the 200 years of independence. The geography will tell you a lot. You need a lot of capacity to overcome geography in a place like Afghanistan and Colombia. Historical-based grievances. You can think of the Balkans and the wars, especially the war in the Bosnia, or the wars involving Serbia and Kosovo. We can have peace for decades, but if that history is still in the memory of different groups and they define themselves as being different groups, that history doesn't go away quickly, so that's something to look for. The regional effect is very important. It tends to be that if you're Belgium and the two parts of Belgium don't quite get along, but you're surrounded by the Netherlands, you're surrounded by Germany, you're surrounded by France, there's even Liechtenstein, which we don't have to talk about, but you're in that neighborhood and you're a member of the EU, those two groups, they may disagree a lot, they may not be able to form a government for 6 months at a time, but they're not likely to kill each other or have a violence over it. But if you're in the Sahel, or if you're in the Horn of Africa, or if you're in Yemen, which is an absolutely incredible country to visit, which I do not recommend going to today with the Houthis and everything, but it was quite an interesting place. Your neighborhood is not really giving you some sort of positive effect, so that's really important. Boundaries, look at the boundaries of countries in Africa. Every time you see a boundary that's a straight line, it's typically artificial, and most of Africa was actually designed. The boundaries were designed in Berlin in the 1880s. In the Middle East, it's the same thing. It was designed in Paris in 1919. So you have very unorganic states and lots of groups that were not working together. And there's little incentives. So little incentives to invest. For companies to invest, you need ease of contract enforcement. You need security of your assets. And when you have weak governments and chronic instability, who is going to invest? If you're going to invest, you're going to invest probably in a big hotel in the capital. You're going to invest in that one mine or that one oil field offshore, and likely you're not going to invest in anything else. And that's more or less the only investment you see in the most fragile states. So these things are characteristics of fragile states, and that's very different than a developing country with a pretty strong government and a pretty good amount of cohesion. And I just love maps, so you'll forgive all the maps I'm going to show you here. So this gives you some map of Nigeria, a country that I used to live in and that I work on. And there is, it depends how you define it, 250 ethnic groups. There's, broadly speaking, 2 religious groups, even though the Catholics and the Protestants don't always get along either. And this country had a civil war in the late 60s, about, I don't know the exact numbers, I don't think anybody knows, but let's say several million people died, often of starvation. And it's a very diverse country, and it has violence in different forms across many, many parts of the country, with only a few exceptions: kidnapping, interethnic conflict over natural resources. I work on the Middle Belt. I work on about 25 million people over 5 states in the Middle Belt. And the biggest source of violence is basically conflict over resources. But that will not make the media. That will make the Boko Haram makes the media. But the real conflict is low level and recurring over and over again. And this is Ethiopia, which is arguably the one country that wasn't colonized. Depends on what you want to think of Liberia in Africa, but actually the historical boundaries of Ethiopia and the current boundaries are somewhat different, because late 19th century the country expanded, but again, very diverse, and a country that was doing pretty well under the president Meles, but since he died and they've removed the authoritarian stamp, so we say, on the country, there's various conflict in many parts of the country. This is Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not only extremely diverse ethnically, religiously, but the physical landscape. Never underestimate the importance of the physical landscape in terms of how much capacity you need to have to actually run a country well. And the more difficult the physical landscape, the stronger capacity you need. And also, the more complex the physical landscape, it tends to be more diverse, the population. Now, this is Myanmar. If you go to East Asia, mostly every country is going in some form in a positive direction. Again, there's variations. What you think of Laos, we could talk, that probably is not going in such a positive direction. But most of East Asia does well. Even Bangladesh Bangladesh is actually one of the more successful states over the last 50 years. And yet you have Myanmar sitting there, conflict after conflict after conflict. The Second World War basically has never ended in Myanmar. It has been in conflict and some form of violence almost continuously from the Second World War. And it tends to have multiple rebel movements fighting the government at the same time. I think at one point there was 5, 6. I think at one time there was a dozen different groups, all ethnically based, fighting the country. Someone can look up the exact number. It reminds me of Somalia, the number of groups that was fighting the last government in the 80s. Every ethnic, every clan, and every sub-clan had their own rebel movement because, again, there's no cohesion. This is Syria, and I think this is Lebanon, This is Lebanon. And Lebanon is, again, very diverse. So you understand, if you look at these countries and you think about the social cohesion and you think about the capacity of the government and the history and the neighborhood, you're learning a lot about how fragile these states are. Again, Lebanon is a very beautiful country. If you go from Beirut up to the Bekaa Valley and then you go down, there is specific ethnic groups in certain areas, but you literally can go town to town to being different ethnic religious groups. There's 16 or 17 different ethnic religious groups in Lebanon. Syria is roughly the same amount. Again, these are in some places very beautiful countries. We're not, let's see now. Not moving here? Somebody want to help me with this? Oh, there we go. That was magic. How did you do that? Is that the next slide? So I'll just end this section, and I want to go to the main section. When I think of a country's capacity to do well, I think of 3 elements matter. Mostly we debate policy, but I will tell you, for countries to do well, you need the cohesiveness and you need the institutions. We debate policy a lot. We do talk about institutions. Look at the recent Nobel Prize on Institutions Matter. Of course, I'm not sure I would agree with the way the people who won it would define it, because China has institutions without democracy, and we could talk about one versus the other. But institutional capacity in terms of implementation, and then we talk about the policy, which is what we mostly focus on, and the cohesiveness. And the institutions plus the cohesiveness, that will tell you how well governed the place is or potentially governed. The policies will tell you where the country is going. North Korea, cohesive and has institutions, but of course we would not agree with the policies. So ideally, if you want a place to thrive, you need all 3 elements working together. Now let's pivot. Why did I write this book? I wrote this book very simply because 2015, 2016, and you can imagine what is going on in American society. I live in Washington, so you can also think Washington being a little different than the rest of the country. I would just go and have coffee with people, as is my tendency. That's how I learn things. That's how I meet people. Just go around and meet and sort of wander around learning what's going on in countries and people. And I kept getting asked, is America becoming a fragile state? And that was partly in jest, but that's surely something about anxiety is driving that question. And of course, I would come back from Sri Lanka or Somalia or Nigeria, and I'm saying, no, this is not the same problems. We're not going to become like one of those countries. But when you get asked this 6, 7, 8 times, you wonder, I got to figure out what is everybody talking about. So I went off on a journey. And I read a lot, and I do what I always do. I read, and I wander around and go to a lot of places and talk to a lot of people. When I go to countries, I always want to do homestays. I always want to go. I did homestays in over 30 countries. I mean, a little bit less today, to be honest, than when I was younger, but I did a lot of homestays, and I love going like places that like just get on the bus and just go and see the country and go to smaller places and understand what's the reality of this country. You're not going to learn it in any hotel in any capital city. And so I did a little bit of this in the United States. And of course, I read. And there's a lot of books. The most famous book probably on American society in recent years is the Bob Putnam book, Bowling Alone. And he has, but he's made a whole career. And I have a few of the books up there, and he's got a couple more. American Grace is not there. And so, I mean, I literally have read probably about 50 books. I had to get a new book case in my living room, which my wife did not want, and we did not have space for, but I wasn't going to get rid of those books so quickly. And what you do is when you read all these books, there's a lot of analysis, there's a lot of lamenting, but there's not a lot of solutions. I mean, Bob Putnam talks about family dinners, and there's good data on family dinners and why they're important, but there's not a direction. And so I'm a person who thinks we need to be practical. We need to come up with some principles. We need to look in terms of what's going on. And I'm a person who thinks relationships matter. All my work, what's unique about it in Fragile States is I start with the social fabric. I start with the relationships between different parts of society. And I think really hard, can we leverage pockets of cohesion? What can we do to create bridging institutions? What can we do to create more cohesion? All of this is really hard work, but for me, the countries that I work in, that is the only way forward. It might be traditional institutions. It might be more bottom-up government. There's a lot of different things that we need to think about. We need to think out of the box. We need to get away from these old solutions. And so, again, just a few slides. This is Bob Putnam with a very good quote. Again, this is from I don't know if this might be from, Bowling Alone is around 2000, and his first article, I think, is around 95. So we're talking about stuff that's been talked about for at least 30 years, and you can find people talking about it before that. There's some well-known sociologists that will talk about our problems in our society and the loss of community going back decades before that. But I have to think about if we have all these problems in America, and I know the politics is the headline, but for me, the politics are always downstream from society. If society is doing well, you're going to solve your economic and your political challenges. And so when we think about the problems we have, and I'm talking about deaths of despair, I'm talking about mistrust, I'm talking about the drugs. I mean, the number of people who die from drugs in America, twice as many in 1 year than died in 20 years of the Vietnam War. That's not on the newspaper front page, but it's shocking, and you can see that in many parts of the country. I'm talking about alienation. I'm talking about mental health. I'm talking about depression. And you can just go on, and the politics, the polarization is only a piece of that. If we think that's downstream from something that's changed in our relationship, what has changed in our relationships? And that is the question that we need to ask. And so I'm just going to give you a very simple framework. And the simple framework is that from the beginning of humanity, and especially from the beginning of basically people living in a place, and then going through the first several hundred years of American history, mostly everyone lived in place-based community. No one had to think about it. It just happened organically because nobody had cars. Nobody had modern planning. All institutions were pretty local. You had local businesses. You had local associations. You had local meeting places. You had local churches, local schools. And that's a lot of institutions, and they're all overlapping, and so are the networks. And therefore, organically, you're part of something. Your place matters. You invest in your place socially, economically, and there's this web of relationships. That is how humanity has, I mean, obviously there were cities and stuff like that, especially from the 19th century, and there was much more movement in America, but mostly everything was being built very bottom up, very organically, place by place by place. Today, we live in a network society. And there's a lot of good things about a network society. It's more dynamic. It can be more meritocratic. People who who can get into the right network, which mostly means you get into the right institution, you get into the right college, you get into the right organization, you can do wonders. If you're willing to work hard and go places and you're good at networking, you're going to do very well. But what happens if we're a network society? What about the places that are not at the center or not part of good networks? What about the people that live in neighborhoods with no good networks? What happens if you're like me and you're not a good networker? Yes, I do all those coffees, but one reason why I intentionally do coffees is because mostly I'm an awful networker. When I was single and you put me in a room with a bunch of singles, I'm that guy in that corner over there on my phone, not talking to anybody. So I can just tell you from my own personal experience that being good at networking is not easy. And many of us are not in the right networks, and many of our places, just because we're in this place, the network actually works against us. The norms, the models, our peers, everything. So and it also means that we don't have the security blanket that we used to have. I happen to live in a very flourishing neighborhood with lots and lots of place-based institutions. And I walk around and I feel like I have this security blanket around me. And it just changes your worldview because you feel almost at peace. You feel at times literally joy because I know who's behind these houses. And I go to the park and I recognize the faces, even though I might not remember them, which is typical of me. And you go into the coffee shop or the restaurant, and I know people, I know the owners of these places. It changes your outlook. But most of us, we are increasingly isolated. We're increasingly vulnerable. Even if we have a lot of material goods, we don't have that social support. And it affects generally our worldview in many ways. And if you look at our life expectancy in the United States, I think there's many reasons why we have this. I know you could talk about our healthcare system. People could talk about insurance. There's a lot of things people could talk about. But I will tell you, our health depends upon where we live, and our health depends on the strength of our social relationships. And there's plenty of data for that on an individual and a place on a neighborhood level. And so for me, this divergence, which again, if I talk about the changes in our relationships, which have happened across the developing world, but it's happening much more extreme in the United States, which is a more atomized, individualistic society. You have roughly from the early 80s this divergence. This is up to COVID. But you can see before COVID, there was a dramatic difference. And that means something is very different about our society than these peer countries. This is a report from last year on isolation. And I want to tell you the place matters. We talked about health. There's a 41-year difference in your lifespan, your expected lifespan, depending upon what neighborhood you live in the United States, 41. A more typical difference will be 20 years. Literally, I can go to two neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and they're 2 miles or whatever apart, and there's a 20-year gap. And you can do that almost anywhere in the country. But it's not only health. I'll get to that in a moment. It's social mobility. It's everything about your life is very much determined, and there's plenty of data on this. So this is from the Center on Developing Child. This is from a report last year. I wish I had this in my book, but honestly, I finished the book before this came out. Jack Shonkoff runs the center, and that is their framework for why place matters. And I will just tell you, if you think about what we mostly debate, we debate the policies. Policies is the outer ring. Yes, it affects the inner rings. The most important ring for the health of a child is relationships. I mean, honestly, if you have kids and you think about them every day and the amount of love you need to really be there day in and day out, even moment in and moment out, depends upon their age. If you don't have that, boy, relationships really matters. But of course, it's the household and the stability. It's the street. It's the neighborhood. Relationships first and foremost. Then you get the physical environment, and then you get culture, policies. And this idea that neighborhood matters goes back about 45 years. This is a very famous professor from Harvard, that the neighborhood effect was really important. He was talking about urban black neighborhoods, but the idea that this matters is recognized everywhere now. This is the most famous expert on social mobility, also at Harvard, Rod Chetty. Papers are pretty dense, but they're easily the best thinking on what makes neighborhoods succeed, not succeed. When you look at some of my data, it's not all of it, but some of it's coming right out of his studies. But I will tell you that social poverty is not only a problem of poor people today, it's also a problem of, we can go to materially well-off neighborhoods. The houses are beautiful. The lawns are nice. Does anybody know each other? And so how does that affect your mindset? How does that affect your views on what goes on? When you think of like mass killings in America, mass shootings, they're not happening. You have more violence in poor neighborhoods, but the people who do the mass shootings are almost always actually boys from middle-class neighborhoods. They're not coming from poor neighborhoods. So you have to ask, why is that? When you look at like teenage, how teens are doing in terms of their mental health, their depression, you're not talking about poor, you're talking about the middle class, and you're talking about the well-being of the next generation. And a lot of it is basically how people are living their lives where they are. I mean, just ask, if you live in a materially well-off place, are you willing to go to your neighbor and talk to them? How well do you know your neighbors? How many people can you knock on the door on your street? I mean, where I live, I constantly feel fortunate because I can just tell you who's in what house. I've been in most of the houses. I'm at 910. I am going in a couple weeks to the wedding of someone at 903, and I can talk about this awful time that my oldest dropped. We have 3 kids. My oldest dropped a younger brother on the cement, bleeding chin. My wife just picked him off and took off down the street and didn't even tell me where he was going. And lo and behold, comes back 40 minutes later, all bandaged up. Went to the nearest nurse or doctor because we know where they live. And your just whole experience is different when you have this web of relationships where you live. But most of us don't have that, and we're actually afraid to show people that we're vulnerable and that we're afraid to show that we are a real person, to be very honest today. So neighborhoods have a huge impact on society and individual well-being. Many of our social ills sit downstream from our basically place-based social dynamics, our neighborhoods. We all live in a place, and yet we have built a placeless society that maximizes isolation and vulnerability. You can see this in our physical landscape. I know Michael is working on a movie, the Social Flourishing group, and they go to Brasilia, and they talk about modernist planning and how that works against good social health. But I'm just telling you, look around America, we don't have it on such a dramatic scale, but we build the physical landscape in ways that there's no way for us to meet each other. I mean, you can always go knock on doors, but are there local places to meet, third places like coffee shops? Are there local schools? Are there local churches? All those institutions, where are they? They're not there. You're driving and you're doing things. And but it's not only the physical, it's the institutions. And what can we do about it? The physical I can show you. It's harder for me to show you the institutions. For me, we want to create a society where everyone has a reason to do things locally. That's not only about interacting locally. If you think about the lack of agency in our society, we have a great concentration of agency in our society because our institutions have become so large. That's whether it's government, companies, nonprofits. It used to be that this country was full of local associations and local businesses and local churches, and that all gave you an abundance of opportunity to actually play a role leading your neighborhood, play a role supporting other people. I mean, it all gave us a role in society. We're in a society where many of us feel we don't have a role. If you read Richard Reeves' work on the problems with men and boys, talk about the loss of agency around many men. It's probably because we have dramatically shrunk the opportunity for agency in our society. And we need lots of strong local institutions. These institutions not only knit our society together, they all give us agency, because we used to be a society in which many, if not most of us, all played a role somewhere where we live. and we've lost the role, and we've lost the relationships. And that affects so much about what we see in our society. Again, the physical landscape matters. This is my friend Tim Sorens, who runs something called Parish Collective. And that's about bringing churches together in neighborhoods to work together to restitch the social fabric. And I do believe our hyper-individualism and our polarization is partly a product of the type of society that we've designed. We can strengthen neighborhoods. So the thing that I really ask, and I'm looking at the time, I'm going to give you one quick example, and then I'm going to give you some takeaways. But the question that I'm always asking, what can we do to strengthen relationships at scale in neighborhoods? And I have this one example in my book from Detroit. Great guy, Chris Lambert, Life Remodeled. And basically, here's a guy who basically created this incredible volunteer program, got to 10,000 volunteers 6 days every year to beautify neighborhoods, fix up houses, all volunteer stuff. People would get to meet and work together, became really well known in Detroit. And he basically wanted people to work with each other, but he understood that people who are different, you're not going to get them to sit down and dialogue. But if you get them to sit down and work together, they're going to develop relationships. So we have polarization because people stop working with each other. He got this opportunity to work for the Detroit Public Schools, and then they offered him an opportunity to turn an empty school building into a community hub, which was a great opportunity. He wanted to do more. The problem was the neighbor became very angry with him. And so what I do is I analyze what is trust and how do you build trust. And he thought that he had trust because he was doing things for people, but that's not how you build trust. Anyone's going to take what you're offering them, but that doesn't mean they trust you. And then you come in and you take over the most beautiful, important building in your neighborhood. No one's going to trust you. They're actually going to be unhappy, especially if you're a white guy from the suburbs, and this is a black neighborhood in the city, and there's a whole history of white people coming in and taking stuff from you. So he had to learn. This is Dwan, who used to be his executive vice president. You had to learn other people's experience. You had to put yourself in the shoes and really learn what does it mean to build trust in a situation where they're not likely to trust you. And we go through what this is all about, and these are just some of the ideas. The key thing is you show up. The key thing is you eat with people. When I work in different countries, the starting point is always food, to be very honest. We bring people together. We're very strategic across ethnic, religious, geographical, whatever groups, and we start with food. And then the more you do the food and the more you meet and the more you show up, you incrementally have cohesion, at least in your group, and they have their networks, diverse networks, internal cohesion. And he gave social leaders influence. He gave them ownership. He embraced their ideas. He actually ended up hiring. He changed his staff so the staff would reflect the neighborhood. What is a simple way to get people to actually know what is going on in the neighborhood, have the networks in the neighborhood, and have the trust of the neighborhood, have people from the neighborhood actually run the organization? So that's eventually, not everyone came specifically from that neighborhood, but they came from nearby neighborhoods. And so he did these things, and ultimately you have to show up and you have to deliver. And if you deliver, people will gradually begin to trust you. But you have to deliver on what they want. And so very much the goals are driven by, he ends up with 2 advisory boards, one of students and one of like the older residents in the neighborhood who are well respected. Redid this building, had 3 areas. And just to close this section, I got a couple more slides, I'm aware of the time, is that they have this 2 data points that came out this year that after I finished the book. And one of them is they have a very unique local survey in Detroit about basically neighborhood-based surveys of the whole city, which doesn't usually happen. And this neighborhood came in second on self-definition of basically what people think about how thriving their place is. And they were much further back in previous surveys. And the crime rate also dropped dramatically. So if you're thinking about ways to build up cohesion in a place, or what we might call collective efficacy, I mean, there's many ways, but this is an example of a community hub with lots of institutions, 39 institutions, and then you very systematically in terms of who you choose, how you relate, how you weave all this together. You're very intentional about social fabric repair through the work of the institutions. And a flourishing society really needs to be based upon flourishing neighborhoods, highly connected, empowered people. Momentum is key. This is how I do some field building work with a bunch of people from across the country. And this is how I would define fragile to flourishing if you're thinking about individual empowerment. If you live in a neighborhood in which you have no institutions or weak institutions or the wrong institutions, they may be encouraging things that aren't in your best interest, and there's low connectivity, I mean bonding and bridging within and across, you're going to be in a very fragile place that will constrain you. If you're in an alternative, you're in a place with a lot of local place-unique institutions. I don't mean Starbucks. I don't mean a chain. I mean a local place that cares. I would call them stewarding institutions. Stewarding institutions is extremely important for any place to do well. We do not think in this terms today, but the more stewarding institutions in a place, the more the neighborhood is likely to be connected, and the more people will. Grand Rapids actually, as a city, has several or many stewarding institutions, which is one thing that makes this place unique compared to other cities in this part of the country. At the neighborhood level, you need stewarding institutions. These are different ways to look at flourishing. Some of it is family, interfamily, informal networks, community institutions. I've talked about bridging. The physical environment can matter a lot, of course. Sources of income, very important. Are people making their own money? Where's their income coming from? If people produce their own income, it makes a dramatic difference in terms of how strong that neighborhood is going to be in the future. Policies, culture, economy is more the one macro element where there's good data. If a city is growing, the neighborhoods have tailwinds. If a city is doing badly, you tend to have headwinds. So that's something that's beyond the neighborhood. Safety matters. And of course, skills, different types of skills. Again, this is a very simple framework. This is based upon some work I've done in South Dallas. And we don't have a framework to think about what this is all about, but you need bonding and bridging. And what does that mean? And again, these are different ways. If a neighborhood is not doing well, what are ways you can do? ABCD is asset-based community development. You want to have a quarterback or a hub or an anchor or just a couple of strong stewarding institutions. Government typically works in silos. It doesn't work for neighborhoods. Atlanta government is trying to change that. Again, bottom-up economic wealth creation, very important. A physical landscape can matter too. That could be mixed income housing versus just putting housing for poor in poor neighborhoods doesn't make the neighborhood or the people better. And these are just some last slides for what you can do. Again, think about the social fabric as being upstream from the things that you worry about. If you don't do the former, you're not going to fix the schools easily. You're not going to improve people's health care outcomes. You're not going to improve social mobility. Every place needs its own institutions. Again, stewarding institutions, not institutions that are transactional. There's a big difference between transactional and stewarding institutions. Government and nonprofits should stop just the silo, care about place. Incremental approach, very important. If you hear about the magic bullet that's going to save something, I would say turn away from that conversation. There are no magic bullets. Maybe I have some here but no, I have no magic bullets. And always remember the who and the when comes before the what and the how. You can have a great idea and a great plan, but it's the people that matter first, and you got to get the timing right. So always start with the relationships, and when the relationships get to a certain point, you're going to know that that's when the when, and then you're going to begin to think about the what and the how. And the what and the how will be, at least to a certain extent, driven by the who and the when. This is why that sequence matters. And this is a great quote from Dreama Gentry, who works in Appalachia in eastern Kentucky. I love that quote. And again, that is me, and thank you. And I'm sorry if I'm a few minutes late. The start was long. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Have a good trip back, you two. Take care. So thank you so much for staying. So I think we're here for questions. We're here. Let's make this interactive. I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to hear what you want to talk about. And so please, we don't do shy here. We stand up and whatever you want to talk about baseball if you want, whatever's on your mind. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I can't see you so well.
You live
Could
in
you just give me your name and where you're coming from?
Sally Driscoll. I'm local.
Okay.
You live in D.C.
I live just north of D.C.,
Okay.
Silver Spring.
Okay. So I'm interested to know what your community was like before you moved into it, what's changed, how you all influenced it, why you chose it.
So that's relatively easy. So I lived in New York when I first got married, and we wanted to be in the right place, and we have constraints on where we can live because I'm religious Jewish person, and therefore I only can live in religious neighborhoods that have other religious Jewish people and some infrastructure. But we knew we wanted to leave, and we didn't know where. So we literally spent a year looking at neighborhoods in New Jersey, looking at neighborhoods in Philadelphia. I knew I wanted to move towards Washington because I would be doing work in Washington. So we literally checked out 5 or 6 neighborhoods, including going there, including sleeping there, including visiting people's homes. Again, you don't learn things without the physical presence and interaction. So we did that. And my neighborhood, there was something very communal about my neighborhood, or communitarian. You could just feel it with the people. I think it's what we might call from New York an out-of-town feeling, because New York is a little bit more transactional at times. It's also that it's like a little bit like an island, because it's not very big. It's not super small, so it has when you have this medium size, like let's say 1,500 families, that's part of my community. I mean, again, it's not only Jewish, but it's, let's say, 1,500 families. You have a critical mass of place-based institutions, and yet everybody can sort of know everybody else through one other person. And so, but it was really, I didn't think that hard about it. It simply was the feeling when I got there. And what has changed? This place, the thing with culture, culture tends to reproduce itself. That's good and bad, because if things are not doing well, how do you change the trajectory of culture? So I would just say my neighborhood it grows. It's gained popularity, and so more people have come to the neighborhood. I would just say that in terms of that. The prices are a bit higher, but my neighborhood is actually surprisingly income diverse. We have 3, maybe 4, depends how you want to count, 4 apartment buildings. So people who need literally, I'm in the suburb, but there are, from 50 years ago, 4 apartment buildings like 25 stories high. And then we have pretty cheap houses. And then you go all the way up, and we have people with a couple $1 million houses. And they're all about 10 minutes from me because I'm in the middle. So I can't think things have changed a lot, but it's become a little bigger, a few more institutions. Hopefully that answers your question. We have a lot of questions. Hi. Please go ahead, just give us your name and what institution or something about yourself.
So I'm Dylan. I work here at Acton. I'm curious. I've heard a lot of these statistics before, and this research is really great in terms of the importance of community and relationships and neighborhoods, as you mentioned, place. But I always wonder about the positive outliers. So, just to make up a statistic, if you say, 65% of people who grew up in an impoverished neighborhood as adults end up impoverished, well, there's 35% who don't, right? There's 2 stories to that statistic. And, in a lot of these places, whether neighborhoods or nations, trying to move from undeveloped or underdeveloped to a developing, flourishing situation, that's going to take time. In some cases, that might take a generation. So is there any work being done on, what makes someone a positive outlier? Like, what is it that facilitates people developing the sort of resiliency that makes them the exception? That seems to me it would be really valuable in the meantime, right? As these communities and these relationships are developing, and all those three different factors that you put up there. So I'm curious if you have if you've done any research on that, on kind of that other side of the coin.
I would say we need to stop having individualistic lens to think about success. We need to think about a relational place-based lens. So if you look at the data on social mobility, I could give you a whole bunch of factors from family structure to commuting time to opportunity to income diversity. And there's vastly different outcomes in terms of social mobility depending upon where you live. You can have two equally poor neighborhoods, and this neighborhood has much, much better social mobility. And again, there's 5 or 6 data points. I've given you a couple of them. And so if you're trying to improve outcomes, you're trying to make more places have those positive factors. I mean, that'd be the very simple way. The idea of thinking that you're gonna help find a solution for all those individuals, I don't think that's the right way to think about our challenges. And the same thing with fragile states. The countries that have done well in the last many decades tend to be more nation states and not highly diverse, weak capacity states. And so, yeah, the best way to succeed in that place is you get a visa and you go someplace else, and that's not a solution for the country. And the same way we try often to help individuals in poor neighborhoods by giving them a visa to a good neighborhood. And that can help the best people, the people who do well to get into a top college or do well in school. And that tends to leave 90+% of the people not doing well. So I understand why we do that, but I don't think it's the right approach.
So when you talk about Detroit, Nancy Kennedy, and when you talk about Detroit, I grew up in the Detroit area, and so you did this study on the one neighborhood.
On the organization in the neighborhood, yes.
Yeah. Do you have any observations on the city as a whole, and if it might be, turning around, or anything you might observe that might be helpful or hurtful for the future?
Yeah, it's hard for me to give you a great answer because I haven't studied Detroit and the history in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And we do know that if you drive around Detroit, there's an awful lot of neighborhoods that don't exist anymore. And the landscape is quite unreal, to be honest. There's not lots of places in the world like that. Of course, with population trends, there probably will be more places like that in the coming decades, unfortunately. But I would say I wrote a piece for one of the Detroit newspapers last year, and I thought it was really important that they take a neighborhood-centric approach because they're going to have to prioritize resources. They're going to have to try to build up, I hate to use the word islands or pockets of success, and that they're not going to be able to do that across all these neighborhoods. So to the extent that they choose a certain number of neighborhoods and make those neighborhoods succeed or help those neighborhoods succeed and bring people into those neighborhoods, probably will, one, save a lot of money, and two, it'll be more likely to work well. So the main answer I would give is, especially in this context, you need a very neighborhood-centric approach. If you go to the center of downtown, you can see that things are better. You can see the fact that there's some building and there's some effort, but you also can see that that's, in terms of geography, it's a relatively small part of the overall city, and that there's some neighborhoods that have survived and some neighborhoods that are on the upturn. The neighborhood that I went to, there's some neighborhoods right near there that are upturn because they have very historical houses that people are literally buying. And I could go and see lots of real estate investors in some coffee shop. But I would say the main thing I would say is it's hard for me to think of a place like Detroit thriving unless it has its, what I would call a spatial strategy, and about which neighborhoods it should focus on and how it approaches each of those neighborhoods. Atlanta, which is very different because Atlanta's population is growing, has a very spatial, neighborhood-centric strategy. And I think a city like Detroit needs it probably even more, given its more challenges that it has. I don't know if that's very helpful. And again, I will be here afterwards, so if you don't get me here, you can get me afterwards. Who's next? Right here. Sorry, please, ma'am. I don't see everybody. What's your name, please?
Hi, I'm Hannah, and
Hannah, H-A-N-A?
N-N-A-H.
Okay, got it.
I've just been here for about a year, and
Coming from where?
Brooklyn, Detroit. Here.
Oh, got it. Okay. Lived in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn,
and
New York,
yeah,
yeah.
keep going.
So the question I have is one that I feel like it's been on my mind for a long while from my experiences with events like this when we're talking about bridging communities. And even from New York, I noticed that with these events, it's usually in a crowd like this where I'm usually the only Black person. And this seems to be like a big problem with America, because just with the example that you gave of Detroit, where a white person came in with very great intention, and yet there's this deep-seated mistrust with the Black community.
Yes.
What kinds of institutions or community-building institutions do you think should be focused on to help bridge this? It's not even a racial divide. It's almost like we don't know the other. Right? We've just been so segregated,
Yes.
even with churches. There's Black churches. And I'm speaking as a Nigerian, so this is all.
Yes, I was thinking
I'm a
you're
foreigner.
Nigerian. That's why I asked you.
Yeah,
Sound-
so-
your accent's very modestly Nigerian.
I am objectively observing the American.
You're from what part of Nigeria?
Igbo.
Igbo, Southeast. I'm guessing the Southeast. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So Nigeria, fascinating country. Can't go to many places with so many smart people, except the country itself doesn't work very well. But a lot of smart people. And from her part of the country, great authors. Always look up Igbo novelists. Highly recommend it. Many, many good Igbo novelists from Achebe onward. So I would say, well, first of all, a couple things I can say. It is true. There's a racial divide in America. There's also a great class divide. And there's an overlap, but it's not the same thing. Native Americans, Hispanics, poor whites, Blacks. The class divide covers all these groups to a certain extent. And we do not have, many of our neighborhoods and the way we live it didn't used to be racially integrated, but it was class integrated. And today, it's probably less racially segregated. It depends upon what in the country you are, but it's certainly less racially segregated. It's much more class segregated than it used to be. But in general, it is true that a lot of institutions are racial or class-based. So, there's two things that we can look at this in two frames. One frame is, which is sort of what the guy Dwan, who I quoted, is what he did. He left this organization. This organization started out being mostly white and ended up being mostly Black. So one thing they did was they actually changed the head. The head is still the head, but the people who run that center, I talked about that neighborhood hub, I think there's one person who's not Black. So it basically became that the institution itself dramatically changed, which helped with the trust and everything. But in general, each neighborhood, and for the Black community in particular, we need and they need lots and lots of strong institutions. So one thing we need to do is invest in terms of incubation, lots of place-based institutions. That guy Dwan went off and he's trying to start, I don't know exactly where he is, but he was going to try to start a credit union for the Black community in Detroit. And Detroit's got a lot of very good social entrepreneurs that happen to be Black, because the city is very, I forgot the specifics, but it's one of the highest percentages of Black population in terms of big cities in the United States. So one thing I would say is, the more the Black community builds up its own strong institutions, and people should help them build this up, the more empowered they will be, and that will also enable them to be more integrated, because even if these are Black, the fact is it gets them at the same table with everybody else. But of course, we also need more bridging. We have so little bridging. We talk about bridging left and right in America. We have very little bridging across class in this country. we do have very little bridging, and we have bridging in places across race. If you go to the universities, if you go to a lot of nonprofits, I think that the nonprofit world, for example, and there are some other parts of our country where it is diverse, but it's not necessarily diverse outside of work. It's not necessarily diverse on the streets. And there's probably some cultural differences that partly explain that. But I do think the more we have bridging institutions in which people work together collaboratively to solve common problems, that could be cross neighborhoods. One of my chapters looks at an organization called Thread in Baltimore. And it's basically poor kids and volunteers helping poor kids and about interfamily dynamics. But it's not helping one the other. It's actually mutually supporting each other and trying to create equal relationships and literally trying to change the social networks of people and having that support system work both ways to help people. So I think we could do a lot more intentionally to build up institutions within different neighborhoods, and we could do a lot more to be more intentional about bridging people. If you look at the Raj Chetty data, the person I quoted on, he will talk about economic bridging across economic class as being one of the key data points that talk about social mobility. And so if you have a small school and it's multi-class, people build cross-class networks. If you have a big school and it brings different classes together, you don't build it the same way. So you can go into the data and think about it, but you need strong bonding and strong bridging to be very simple. Sorry for the long answer.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important because it lets us know what topics you are interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Mark Townsend.